In the soft static of a radio long faded, there are songs you knew by heart, sung by voices time is nearly silenced. This is a journey through 25 bands from the 1970s that once stirred the soul, now tucked behind memory's curtain. Let's bring them back into the light, if only for a while. Fleetwood Mac. The story of Fleetwood Mac doesn't begin with stardom or scandal, but with slow-burning rhythm in the London fog. In 1967, long after midnight and far from radio towers, they were a blues outfit born of cigarette smoke and stubborn persistence, led by Peter Green, whose guitar lines drifted through the air with a kind of aching restraint. Alongside Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, he helped shape a group that played not for fame, but for the sheer weight of expression. Their early success came wrapped in melancholy tones, until personal struggles forced Green to part ways. Over time, others came aboard. Christine McVie brought melodic elegance, while Bob Welch added a thread of poetic tension. Then, as the band crossed the Atlantic, two California voices, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, joined, steering the music toward a more layered, emotionally charged path. The blend worked. Their self-titled album in 1975 reached the top, but their next release, Rumors, brought them immortality. Written in the storm of broken relationships and creative friction, it captured private anguish through harmony and lyric. The result was raw, vivid, and deeply human. In a world constantly changing, Fleetwood Mac gave people something that stayed with them, a truth set to melody. Big Star. A song doesn't need to top the charts to find a home in someone's heart. In Memphis, in the early 1970s, Big Star gathered melodies that shimmered like heat off a two-lane highway in August. Their records weren't built for arenas. They spoke in quieter tones, meant for those listening alone with the volume turned low. Alex Chilton, who had already tasted stardom with the Box Tops, brought a different kind of wisdom this time. Stories shaped by longing, by restlessness, by afternoons that never quite ended the way they began. Their first album, #1 record, glowed with promise. But distribution faltered, and the music never made it as far as it should have. Radio City followed, full of craft and conviction, though recognition stayed out of reach. Disappointment settled in, and the group drifted apart. Yet time has a way of circling back. Musicians who once played their songs on borrowed guitars, bands like REM and The Replacements, grew up carrying Big Star's spirit with them. College radio took notice. Songs like 13 and September Girls returned, not as relics, but as anchors for a new generation. Though Big Star's light flickered early, it never truly vanished. It simply waited to be found. Lynyrd Skynyrd. What song takes you back to a dirt road in summer, windows down, and a voice on the radio that knew exactly what it meant to come from the South? For countless listeners, it was Lynyrd Skynyrd who captured that feeling with grit and grace. Emerging from Jacksonville, Florida, they stitched together bluesy riffs, hard truths, and a Southern identity that wasn't polished, but it was real. Their debut album in 1973, pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd, offered more than radio singles. Freebird soared with raw ambition, while Simple Man spoke plainly to folks trying to raise a family and keep their heads high. As the years passed, their music grew sharper. Second Helping brought new anthems, and then came Sweet Home Alabama, a bold reply to Neil Young, a defense, a declaration, and a complicated love letter to a region scarred by history. Skynyrd gave people something to rally around, but in 1977, tragedy struck hard. A plane carrying the band went down in Mississippi, claiming the lives of Ronnie Van Zant, Steve Gaines, Cassie Gaines, and others. In that instant, the rising arc of Southern rock collapsed into silence. Yet what remains endures, guitorial lines, lyrics, and a legacy rooted deep in red clay. M-pop music. Sometimes, all it takes is one song to catch the turning wind of an era. In the fall of 1979, Robin Scott released a track under the name M, a track that buzzed with wires instead of strings and spoke more than it sang. Pop music arrived right as punk's fire was cooling and disco's glitter began to fade. Its clipped cadence and synthetic rhythms turned heads in nightclubs and studios alike. The lyrics moved briskly, calling out genres, trends, and commercial excesses as if paging through the headlines of modern life. Beneath the groove pulsed a commentary, subtle but sharp. Radio stations embraced it, so did chart watchers from London to Los Angeles. The single reached the top in the US, the UK, and Australia, threading its way into both dance floors and mainstream radio. Scott didn't follow it with another hit, but what he created left an imprint. In the years that followed, new acts emerged: Depeche Mode, The Human League, and Duran Duran, each drawing from that same electric stream. Pop music didn't merely ride a wave, it caught a current few had noticed. And though M faded from view, the track endured, humming in the circuitry of every decade that came after. Do you remember hearing any of these bands on late-night radio or vinyl growing up? We'd love to hear about it. The Suite. How does a group known for sequins and stomping choruses end up chasing something far more elusive? Respect. In London's crowded music halls of the late 1960s, a band calling themselves the Sweet Shop began carving a place for themselves amid the clamor. They dropped a word from their name and picked up a sound engineered for the pop charts. Hits like Coco and Funny Funny, penned by the hit-making duo Nicky Chin and Mike Chapman, gave them their first taste of chart success. But that polished exterior concealed the group restless to prove their grit. By 1973, Blockbuster brought a harder edge, letting the band stretch into louder, bolder territory. From there, Ballroom Blitz and Fox on the Run kept the airwaves buzzing and crowds stomping. Yet the more they leaned into rock, the more they clashed with the pop persona built around them. Guitarist Andy Scott pushed for creative control, and frustrations mounted. Meanwhile, frontman Brian Connolly struggled under the weight of it all. Shifting musical trends and internal strain brought the run to a halt in 1981. What remains is the mark they left, uneven at times, but cut from a fabric threaded with ambition, rebellion, and a need to be more than a costume. The Carpenters. On warm evenings in Downey, California, the Carpenter household often echoed with piano chords and brushed cymbals. Richard and Karen, still teenagers, found harmony not only in their music but in the rhythms of family life. Their early group, the Richard Carpenter Trio, leaned into jazz, where Karen kept time from behind a drum kit long before most audiences ever saw her center stage. By 1969, they had become the Carpenters, releasing Offering, a careful debut that went largely unnoticed. Patience paid off the following year. With Close to You, they reached millions. Karen's voice carried a kind of softness that wrapped around Burt Bacharach's melodies and made them unmistakable. The album earned Grammys, radio play, and a steady place in American living rooms. But fame cast a long shadow. While applause followed them from concert halls to studio sessions, Karen faced a growing struggle far removed from the spotlight. Anorexia nervosa, a condition rarely spoken of in those years, gradually overtook her. Though her voice stayed clear in every recording, her health declined behind the scenes. In 1983, at only 32, she passed away. Her loss gave rise to a deeper conversation, one about health, silence, and how much pain can hide behind a song. Joy Division. In the northern shadow of Manchester's aging mills and damp cobblestones, a band began to shape a sound that didn't seek attention. It settled in the bones. Joy Division formed in 1976, steeped in the gray skyline and the rain-soaked pace of the city. Rather than follow fashion, they turned inward. Their music traced personal landscapes, sharp guitars, clipped rhythms, and lyrics that stared straight through despair. Ian Curtis, his voice low and distant, carried those words with a kind of gravity that didn't rise, but drew listeners in. In 1979, Unknown Pleasures appeared, wrapped in monochrome waves and deliberate mystery. The record raised no banners, it posed questions, offered edges. Tracks such as She's Lost Control and Disorder didn't charge ahead, they hovered, uneasy and exact. As word spread, so did the burden of expectation. By the spring of 1980, the group prepared for a US tour. It never came to pass. Curtis died that May, leaving a silence the band wasn't sure how to fill. Closer emerged, stark and spare, and then came Love Will Tear Us Apart, a track both plain-spoken and haunting. Although Joy Division ended, their work continued to resonate, unvarnished, honest, and drawn from the darker corners of human experience. Badfinger. Which path leads a band from promise to tragedy so swiftly, with barely a pause in between? Badfinger arrived with talent, timing, and the kind of endorsement most artists never see, the backing of the Beatles' own Apple Records. Their early tracks, No Matter What and Baby Blue, carried the shimmer of chart-ready hooks and harmonies shaped by craftsmanship, not trend. Listeners heard echoes of Mersey beat pop, but sharpened with urgency. Success knocked quickly, but behind the curtain, storms brewed. By 1975, Pete Ham passed away under circumstances shaped by legal chaos, unpaid royalties, and overwhelming pressure. His absence marked a painful turn. Tom Evans, struggling with many of the same burdens, would later be lost as well. Mike Gibbons died years on, leaving Joey Molland as the last link to the band's beginnings. Through all of it, the music endured. Albums such as No Dice, Straight Up, and Wish You Were Here remain intact, resilient, honest, and admired by those chasing a blend of polish and vulnerability. Their association with Apple, once a doorway to greatness, became a weight. But even through it all, their songs continue to echo with conviction, asking not to be footnotes, but chapters worth hearing. The Guess Who's. In the prairie winds of Winnipeg, long before most listeners south of the border knew their name, a group of young musicians began stitching together a sound that didn't quite belong to either coast. The Guess Who started off playing what others had already made famous: covers, familiar chords, borrowed lyrics. But as the decade turned, they found their own footing. They leaned into psychedelia, folded in sharp social commentary, and let their Canadian roots seep into every line. In 1969, These Eyes broke through, leading them beyond the coffee houses and hockey arenas. Hits began to gather: No Time, Laughing, Share the Land. And then came American Woman, a fierce anthem with a heavy riff and pointed lyrics, which soared to the top of the US charts in 1970. Success, though, came with fractures. As creative tensions mounted, Randy Bachman departed, and later, Burton Cummings too. Lineup changes and shifting styles followed, sometimes jazz-influenced, sometimes progressive, never quite settling. By the mid-1970s, the band's direction blurred, and their chart presence faded. But in the broader story of rock's golden era, the Guess Who held a seat of their own, rugged, regional, and brimming with ambition. Their voice carried farther than anyone expected. The Runaways. Beneath the glare of Hollywood lights and the rumble of passing traffic, the Runaways took shape, raw, fearless, and far ahead of their time. They weren't groomed for radio or softened for critics. Joan Jett, Lita Ford, and their bandmates kicked down every closed door with leather jackets, snarling riffs, and a message that didn't need polish to be heard. When Cherry Bomb hit the airwaves, it wasn't an introduction, it was a detonation. Their music pushed against the grain, fusing punk grit with glam swagger and hard rock muscle. Audiences responded. They recorded 4 studio albums, toured internationally, and found unexpected stardom in Japan, where crowds greeted them with thunderous adoration. But behind the amps and applause, tensions gathered. Jet leaned toward raw rebellion. Ford favored technical firepower. Their ambitions, though equal in strength, pulled in opposite directions. Arguments escalated. The road grew harder. And by New Year's Eve of 1978, the band came to a close. They didn't last long, but they didn't have to. The Runaways proved something few had dared to say out loud, that young women with guitars could rattle the foundation of rock and leave it changed forever. Love this kind of nostalgic journey? Hit that subscribe button so you won't miss what's coming next. Wild Cherry. Who could have guessed that one offhand comment from the crowd would launch a platinum hit? In the early 1970s, Rob Parisi led Wild Cherry with a gritty rock edge and a restless desire to stand out. Their name, borrowed from a cough drop box, carried a quirky charm, but their early music stayed rooted in hard rock. Then, one night, at a club where the crowd expected something funkier, a voice shouted a challenge that stuck. "Play some funky music, white boy." Parisi took it home, wrote through the night, and came back with a track that would change everything. Play That Funky Music hit like a freight train, funk grooves, guitar riffs, and a hook that didn't let go. It reached #1 on both the pop and R&B charts, cutting across genres and demographics with ease. For a while, Wild Cherry rode that wave, their single blaring from jukeboxes and dance floors from coast to coast. But follow-ups failed to capture the same fire. The band struggled with expectations and faded by decade's end. Still, that one anthem never left the air. It plays on, loud as ever, daring anyone nearby to move, and reminding us that great songs sometimes begin with a shout from the back of the room. Derek and the Dominos. Some bands leave behind a single record so raw, so charged with longing, it carries more weight than entire discographies. Derek and the Dominos was such a band. Eric Clapton, seeking distance from the spotlight, found comfort in the camaraderie of Delaney and Bonnie. From those sessions came a new collaboration, more weathered, more honest. Joined by Bobby Whitlock, Carl Radle, and Jim Gordon, Clapton created a group that didn't chase image. They leaned into blues and soul, letting each track breathe with grit and heart. Their 1970 release, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, remains a landmark. Driven by Clapton's love for Pattie Boyd and elevated by Duane Allman's aching slide guitar, the title track stands among the most anguished declarations ever committed to vinyl. The rest of the album echoes with urgency, songs not polished, but alive. Yet behind the studio doors, the weight of fame and pressure began to take a toll. Allman's death, barely a year later, left an absence that couldn't be filled. Arguments followed. By 1971, the band dissolved. Their time was short, but their voice endures. Layla remains, a record that speaks in truths few artists ever dare to say aloud. King Crimson. Why does some music feel less like a performance and more like a provocation? King Crimson never aimed to comfort. From their earliest days, they demanded attention, and perhaps discomfort, from anyone who dared to listen. Their debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, released in 1969, shattered the boundaries of what rock records could contain. It didn't simply blend jazz, classical, and avant-garde impulses. It let them wrestle. The cover screamed before the needle ever dropped, and tracks like 21st Century Schizoid Man left no room for passivity. The band became a revolving door of talent. Ian MacDonald, Greg Lake, and Michael Giles came through, contributed their colors, and moved on. Through every shift, Robert Fripp remained, steady, unbending, searching for new ways to pull structure out of chaos. From album to album, the group reassembled itself, shedding skins and directions without warning. That constant reinvention strained relationships and tested stamina. By 1974, the toll had mounted too high, and the band unraveled under the weight of its own ambition. Still, King Crimson's fingerprints remain on generations of musicians who heard their challenge and accepted it. Artists who weren't looking for comfort, but for something far more curious. Montrose. Montrose didn't ease into the hard rock scene. They kicked the door wide open. Their 1973 debut album arrived with grit and swagger, driven by Ronnie Montrose's blistering guitar work and Sammy Hagar's raw vocal power. Bill Church handled bass with steady authority, while Denny Carmassi's drums pounded with purpose. Songs such as Rock Candy and Bad Motor Scooter charged forward with a kind of urgency that made listeners take notice. The album earned critical praise and a loyal base of fans who craved something bold and unfiltered. As their profile rose, tensions began to surface. Hagar, eager to expand his creative reach, found himself at odds with Montrose's direction. The divide widened, and after the release of Paper Money in 1974, Hagar exited the group. Montrose pressed on, bringing in new voices and exploring fresh ideas. Though the band continued to perform and record, the chemistry that had sparked their early success proved difficult to recapture. By 1977, the energy that once fueled their rise had cooled. The band disbanded, leaving behind a sharp impression of early promise. Their legacy remains grounded in that explosive first record, a blueprint for American hard rock at its most unrelenting. Television. New York, in the mid-1970s, had a kind of electricity pulsing through its underground clubs, and in one of those dim corners stood a band named Television. They weren't chasing stardom, they were sculpting something stranger, something sharper. With the release of Marquee Moon in 1977, they delivered a record that broke free from the rough simplicity of punk and rewrote what a rock song could become. The title track stretched over 10 minutes, not in self-indulgence, but in exploration. Guitars circling one another, unraveling with an elegance few had attempted. But behind the intricate arrangements, discord simmered. Tom Verlaine's meticulous approach stood in constant contrast with Richard Hell's raw, untamed energy. Hell exited early, reshaping the band's direction. Though adventure followed in 1978, the cohesion began to slip. The creative machinery that once thrived on tension grew worn and uncertain. That same year, they disbanded, quietly, without drama. And yet, their influence spread like ink on parchment. In rehearsal spaces and on college radio frequencies, younger bands took note. Sonic Youth, REM, and others carried forward their experimental flame, building on a foundation Television had laid with stubborn resolve and quiet brilliance. Did we leave out a band you think deserves to be remembered? Drop their name below. Let's build this list together. The Sex Pistols. No band ever set fire to the musical rulebook quite like the Sex Pistols. Born in the heart of mid-70s London, their presence wasn't polished. It was jagged, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. With Johnny Rotten snarling into the mic, Steve Jones hammering out guitar riffs, Paul Cook anchoring the drums, and Glenn Matlock, later Sid Vicious, wielding the bass, they were a spark in a powder keg already smoldering with discontent. The Pistols didn't drift into the charts. They crashed through the front door with Anarchy in the UK, a song that didn't ask for permission. Its fury echoed through concrete and council flats alike, tapping into the restless energy of a youth fed up with crumbling systems. The media fanned the flames after a controversial television appearance, turning outrage into infamy. Then came Nevermind the Bollocks, a record that captured a cultural shift in a single, breathless shout. It wasn't merely an album, it was a line in the sand. And yet, fame's corrosive weight took its toll. Clashes escalated. A US tour faltered. By early 1978, the band collapsed under the very revolution it helped ignite. Their reign was short, but the tremor they left has never quite settled. The Jam. Where does conviction end and reinvention begin? For the Jam, that line was drawn not by failure, but by vision. Born in the hum of British suburbia and raised on defiance, the trio stormed into 1977 with In the City, a record that punched with urgency and spoke for working-class kids in Thatcher's England. Paul Weller's pen found rhythm in unrest, and his voice carried the sharp edge of frustration wrapped in purpose. Their trajectory didn't flatten. With This Is the Modern World and All Mod Cons, they expanded their language, borrowing textures from Motown, lifting structure from the Kinks, and weaving it all with Weller's evolving grasp of narrative. The anger remained, but it learned how to sing. Despite towering success in Britain, international stardom remained elusive. But that never dulled their ambition. By 1982, with chart-topping albums behind them, Weller disbanded the group on his own terms, believing the message had been delivered. He went on to build new sounds with the Style Council, and later explored deeper waters as a solo artist. The Jam didn't fade. They ended with intention. Sha Na Na. Gold lame jackets shimmered beneath the summer sun in 1969, when a doo-wop group no one expected became a surprise sensation at Woodstock. Sha Na Na, with their synchronized moves and throwback harmonies, delivered a set that turned heads and won over a crowd hungry for something both familiar and fresh. Their set closed with cheers that echoed far beyond the muddy fields of upstate New York. Soon after, the band's retro flair found a second life on the silver screen. Greece welcomed them as Johnny Casino and the Gamblers, where their rendition of Rock and Roll Is Here to Stay helped stitch the soundtrack into American pop history. Television soon followed, and by 1977, they had their own weekly series, a colorful variety show blending humor with stage performances. Even with all that exposure, they never stopped touring. They kept the spirit of the 50s alive throughout the 70s and beyond, recording albums and bringing doo-wop charm to new audiences. Though the world around them kept changing, Sha Na Na held to their roots, harmonies tight, pompadours high, and rhythm always in step. Budgie. You could hear the thunder of ambition in every Budgie riff, rising from the working-class streets of cardboard with a sound too heavy for the radio, but too good to be ignored. They didn't chase the spotlight, they carved their own path through it, armed with a bass that rumbled, a guitar that soared, and drums that struck like hammers on steel. This trio, led by Burke Shelley's sharp vocals and unmistakable bass work, crafted songs that shook the walls of club stages and festival grounds alike. Tony Borges' guitar licks blended raw grit with a touch of melody, while Ray Phillips's percussion never lost its momentum. Together, they made music that felt hand-forged, unpolished, loud, and full of heart. Their catalog, rich with fierce tracks like Bread Fan and Crash Course in Brain Surgery, would echo far beyond their era. While fame never met them head-on, their fingerprints are all over heavy metal's roots. Bands that followed picked up what Budgie laid down, carrying it forward into louder, faster generations. And though their name stayed small on marquees, their legacy rings large among those who listened closely. The Modern Lovers. A worn guitar, a handful of chords, and the voice of a boy who sounded like he was still figuring out what to do with his heart. That was the beginning of the Modern Lovers. In the early 1970s, amid the grit and snowbanks of Boston, Jonathan Richman gathered a group of musicians who shared his yearning for something simple and sincere. He wrote about life the way it looked out a windshield: strip malls, heartbreaks, highways humming with neon signs. Their songs came lean, without pretense. Roadrunner pulsed with the rhythm of late-night drives. Pablo Picasso wandered through art and irony. Hospital didn't ask for sympathy, it gave you truth. The band wasn't built to last. Creative friction, shifting labels, and Richman's own restless nature pulled them apart before the world caught up. Their recordings, shelved for a time, finally surfaced in 1976. What had seemed too odd for the mainstream became gospel for the underground. Future bands drew from the plainness, the raw grace, the wit. The Modern Lovers, in their short run, left something behind. A blueprint for honesty with an amplifier. Blue Oyster Cult. Have you ever heard a song that felt like a page torn from a forgotten novel, half science fiction, half ghost story? Blue Oyster Cult made a career out of spinning those kinds of tales. While most recall the eerie echo of Don't Fear the Reaper, their catalog wandered far beyond the reach of a single hit. Their music wove together tales of monsters, mysticism, and mechanized futures, each one wrapped in thick riffs and lyrics that read like coded warnings. Godzilla lumbered into the public imagination with playful menace, while Burnin' For You glowed with a slow, smoldering intensity. Each track revealed a band unafraid to explore the strange and the cerebral. Their records didn't always light up the charts, but they lit up imaginations. The group built a kind of cult following, fitting perhaps, among listeners who sought depth inside distortion and poetry within chaos. While others chased hits, Blue Oyster Cult carved their place through atmosphere, precision, and storytelling. Their influence continues to spark through generations of hard rock. Which of these forgotten groups struck a chord with you? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this trip down a musical back road, Be sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss what's next.